For those that are curious to know, the people of Nod come from Cain and Enoch. So Enoch was the son of Cain, and Cain, we know, was the first murderer in biblical lore. And Enoch was said to be the author of the Book of Enoch, which was written about third or so century to the first century. There's several books, but the first one was written about 300 something BCE, and give or take, and the last of the books were about 100 BCE around or so, and so they were very elemental in influencing Jesus and John the Baptist. So this is how the story goes. Cain killed Abel. That's deep biblical lore. It's not exactly history. It's just a mythology. And then Enoch, who could have been a real historical character, we don't know, but he's definitely part of this pre-Abraham mythology. Part that between Adam and Eve and Abraham. They're all pretty much mythological characters. Some of them probably were historical characters at one point, maybe all of them, but, many of them are, more like universal mythologies rather than real historical characters turned into mythologies. There's a difference. And so, Enoch was born in the land of Nod. Land of Nod is where Cain was driven to after he killed Abel. And Enoch was said to have been one of the only men to have seen heaven, gone to heaven without having to die first. And the only other man was Elijah, who gets taken up in a whirlwind and is seen by Elijah and then Jesus, but he died, of course, and then resurrected and then went to heaven. But all these three were said to have sent up into heaven, and then within the flesh, which is quite unheard of. But there are we'll not get too far into all that. Anyways. Moving on to Enoch and the Book of Enoch. So the Book of Enoch was created around 3rd or so century BCE to 100 BCE, and it was in retaliation to what was happening in the Jewish temple and in Jewish society, and it was also so around this time, Alexander had come through previous and had taken over. So for the next several hundred years, Jewish lands and stuff and all surrounding territories were run, overseered by Greek kings and stuff. And in the Jewish temple, they started to force pagan worship, and in some ways they didn't have to force it, because a lot of priests and a lot of people were easily becoming Hellenized. They were being, as the rest of as more of like your Book of Enoch writers and stuff saw it, as these people were fallen prey to devilish powers, so to say, and so and they were being seduced, and they were fallen for carnal enticements and stuff offered by the great powers, by the material powers of the king and stuff, and so people were selling their souls essentially. And so this is where you get the in the Book of Enoch you get the mythology of the fallen angels, which goes back to Zoroastrianism, but the way we understand fallen angels, it goes through this period of transition. So there's a Zoroastrian history that's like way older than what we're talking about, goes back like 4,000 years or so, maybe a little bit less, but um, they had this understanding of good and evil and all these things, and of the apocalypse, and of these demons and angels, sort of, a little bit different wording, but uh, the what they call devas is what the Hindus called angels, and so and then what we started calling them daemons, which is coming from the Greek translations of the Bible, of the Old Testament and the New Testament by Jewish and Christian writers. They were when they were taking a Greek word daemon, which usually refers to something that it's like a god. It's another word that you can use to, like, daemons is often used in Homeric hymns to refer to, like, the gods, or like, so, like, part of their essence, and it's also been described as that which defined as that which separates things, like it's like a fate. And so daemon, when I started when people started to translate these Jewish concepts into Greek, they decided to use, like, anything that referred to idol gods were by Jewish and Christian writers. They would use the word daemon, and anyone that was speaking of like in the New Testament, when they spoke about, like, foul, filthy spirits or whatever, they used the word daemon, and so that's where we start getting our understanding of demon, and this kind of brings us back to the Book of Enoch, because demons are said to be like the children of, like, the fall, like children or beings of the fallen angels. The fallen angels are essentially like the highest demons, and as this is the way Christians and Jews, nominally understand it today. And so, but the fallen angels that they are speaking about in the Book of Enoch are really just like the Greek gods and their children. And so you have to understand that they were writing this stuff in the context of being ensnared by the worship of these gods and this religion coming into their religion. And this is back in the day where people didn't see it as like, hey, my religion's right, yours is wrong. That didn't really start happening until Christianity, because back then it was like all the religions were right. I mean, maybe my God was better, or we had a fidelity to our God, but we didn't see your God as different. We saw it was all true. And so to a lot of the early writers, if not to every single one of them, maybe they saw these Greek gods as not, it's not just like madnesses in the Greeks' mind. They saw these, no, these were real things, and they used to be these gods like Zeus and Hermes and Poseidon and Athena and stuff. They used to be angels, is the way they saw it, is the way they understood it, and angels of God. And then they fell in love with the daughters of man, which is the stories of the Greek stories of the gods and stuff are ripe with the gods, falling in love with mortals and having children with them, and you got your offspring of giants or Nephilim, and so these stories, like, it goes back to like Genesis 6, which were like way before the Book of Enoch were written. These were oral stories, and they, were very old, and they were, it was basically, they might have been part of some larger corpus of stories that were lost, and then at some point, Book of Enoch, writers were like, hey, let's go back and, this is what this means. They decide they start drawing their own correlations, in the context of everything that was happening to them historically. And remember, this is pre-science, pre-real scholarism, you can say, and so these ideas that we would take as being mad, or just made up, or you know j- they didn't see it like that. It was all very real. And so and so and so the fallen angels were essentially demigods, like Hercules and stuff, like the giants and the Nephilim, and they were seen to be like this wicked race upon the earth, perverting like the true one, which is like the Jewish race and stuff, or people, and so and so that's like the history right there behind the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch was really just people rebelling from Hellenization. The writers of the Qumran, probably butchering that, Qumran society, were they're the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch, and all these different things. They saw themselves, so these people were coming out of the whole history with Babylon and having lost their first temple, their first kingdom, and they were under, and ever since then they were a proxy state pretty much for someone else, under someone else's authority, and or someone under someone else's benefice, and it was after the destruction of the first temple, and the destruction of Judah and Israel, and their kingdoms, the Babylonians took over, and they had them in captivity for 70 years or so. And then when they were released from captivity is when the Jews started absorbing all these concepts from Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was practiced by Cyrus the Great, and Zoroastrianism is all about virtue and goodness, and that being and and it's all about the wars between good and evil, and Armageddon, and the apocalypse. And so all these concepts that we take as very Christian or very Jewish are originally Zoroastrian. And so and they're and so when the Jews, they absorb all these ideas from their time in captivity, but then also from Cyrus the Great had shown them a certain magnanimity, and so you can say they were inspired by many of these Zoroastrian principles that seemed to be quite noble and stuff, and so they quite willingly absorbed a lot of these concepts, and so you can argue, and so the apocalypse, the apocalypse theology really starts kicking off around 4th, 3rd BCE, and Book of Enoch is an example of this. And they were a society of people that were, they were rebelling from Hellenization, rebelling from materialism, and from all these corruptions, and civilization, and they were creating, they were becoming renunciates, they were deeply mystical and stuff, and they saw themselves as preparing an age for the new kingdom. This goes back to like the Book of Micah and stuff, like the last chapters where he speaks of Elijah coming to bring about the new kingdom of heaven. If he doesn't, he's coming. It says Elijah's coming to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, the hearts of the children to their fathers. And if this doesn't happen, then it's woe, 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 woe upon the earth, and deep destruction. And you can see it today. If love doesn't happen, if we don't make some kind of message and declaration and some kind of fire of love, we're going to end in a conflagration of nuclear hatred. That's the way the world is going with global warming and all these wars and stirring. It's like if Elijah doesn't return, or a spirit like that, and to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children to their fathers, that I see only just more and more terrible things happening, in complete utter conflagration that's no good. And so that's kind of where it's one of those biblical prophecies that it's hard for me not to believe. And then there's and so John the Baptist, he was a part of this lineage of men going back to the beginning of the Book of Enoch, and who believed that they were, it was their duty to prepare the way for the messianic age, and for essentially a big apocalypse. And so they're deep renunciates, spiritual warriors, and and Jesus became one of them. He was a disciple of John the Baptist, and several of his disciples were former disciples of John the Baptist, and he baptized all his disciples, or they baptized all each other, and they kept the baptism is kept by all Christians today. And so, but they have forgot the meaning of baptism, and its baptism was always about calling us away from Babylon, calling us away from materiality and civilization and all their hegemonies and all their conflict and all their corruption and all their lies and all the malaise and all the suffering and the depression and the meaninglessness. And it was to restore the soul into the simplicity of birth, of a rebirth through the water canals. And it was to retouch with grace and nature. And it was and they and it was John the Baptist has said, no wine ever went past his lips, all these things. He was very gentle, very good, but he was also fiery. And that's why he was killed, is because he was fiery, and he was not afraid to put his voice against the greatest of powers that be, and he was killed for it. And so was Jesus later on, and so were just about all the apostles. They were the most gentle to the gentle, but they were the most severe to the most severe, and that cannot be forgotten. We must remember that we are to be the most gentle to the most gentle and most severe to the most severe. Amen.